I'm attorney Howard Ankin for another episode of Chicagoans You Should Know. As an attorney, I get to do a lot of cool things, and tonight is possibly one of the coolest things that I'll get to do, and getting a chance to talk to longtime weatherman Tom Skilling of WGN.
Well, Howard, I'm going to tell you something. I've watched you over the years, and I thought, you know, I'd like to meet this man. So it's an honor to have you in here in our weather office. Thank you. And by the way, you also sponsor our 7-day forecast, so thank you for that. I keep telling people we wouldn't be doing what we do were it not for people like you who back us in doing that. So thank you for that very much.
Tom, the honor's all mine. You know, we're really here to ask some questions
Sure.
about who is Tom Skilling, and we get to kind of pull the curtain back a little and get to understand you.
Yeah.
Just sitting where we're sitting right now, I never really understood that this is like where some of the weather is shown. Tell us where we are right now.
Well, we're right in the newsroom. Do you know when I started here in 1978, this was the combined WGN radio and TV newsroom. And we had carpeting that was so stained. There was a story about every stain on the carpeting. Well, they later built the newsroom where it is now, and that freed up this space, so they turned it into a weather office. And in the back of this studio, we used to, when we had CLTV on the air, they did CLTV weather over there. But what we do here is at the top of the show, or when there's a tornado warning, we come out of here, right out of the weather office, where we have access to all of our data feeds and all the rest. And then I go across the hall into the TV studio, where we work with the chroma key, the green screen that you stand in front of, and we program the computer back here, and I set up the order in which the graphics will show up. And I start at 8 in the morning pulling down all the model guidance and all. It's just amazing the array of data we look at and have available these days in meteorology. In fact, you know, I've been doing this for about a half a century, and what's happened in this science in the last 50 years is just stunning. You know, it was Aristotle, 340 BC, who wrote the first treatise on meteorology that started it as a science. But in the last 50 years, we've probably come farther than we had in all the time from Aristotle up to the present time. We have satellites now, Doppler radar, incredible computing capability. I went to school at the University of Wisconsin. That's the birthplace of satellite meteorology. There was a professor up there, Werner Sumi, who believed that if we put these floating platforms up over the equator and watched the weather 24 hours a day, and we had them positioned around the planet, we could see every weather system from birth to death, including over the 70% of the planet that's ocean and therefore poorly observed, or was up till the advent of satellites. So what they did up there, we sat in classrooms watching landfalling hurricanes that nobody in my line of work had ever seen up to that point in time. And all I could think was, as somebody who was destined for a career in meteorology, wow, I want to bring this to television. And of course now, we not only have it on television, you've got it on handheld devices and so forth. So it's really remarkable.
When you're going to meteorology school, how many people are there to be meteorologists, or how many people actually become on air explaining meteorology to people?
You know, one of the latest census I've seen of our profession is there are about 12 or 13,000 operational meteorologists, and a great number of them are in media weather. There's been an exponential growth in the number of television stations that want somebody other than a rip and reader, which used to be the sort of weather presentation you got from people who really didn't have any expertise in weather. But the weather's become important, and I think you know, people in our profession realize it is that way. It's a life or death situation in the worst case scenario, and a curiosity and on a day-to-day basis on the part of most people. Yeah, I've always thought the person who does the weather has a very unique relationship with the audience that our news colleagues don't as much, because we're dealing with something in the weather that affects everybody in some way, shape, or form. The effects might be as modest as how do I dress tomorrow, or if you work outside, am I going to be able to work, or am I going to be shoveling snow, to the way our moods alter based on weather. Even the way medicines work is affected by the weather. So it's a pretty fascinating area, and we understand it today better than we ever have before. It's a complex system. We're not perfect, But I'll tell you one thing, if I had a dime for every time somebody said, boy, do I wish I had a job where I could be wrong every day and keep my word, I'd be a rich man, you know. It's crazy. And I think, I tell these people, I said, if you think I could be wrong every day and keep my job, you got another thought coming. I'd be escorted out the door before I could say, what the heck is going on here, you know? We actually are pretty good most of the time now. The people remember the busts, but there's been fantastic progress in meteorology.
Before we talked about the progress,
yeah,
let me get back to like even the beginning stages of school. Did they teach you how to do the presentation? Is there like, you're doing classes on meteorology.
Yeah, yeah.
Are they giving you classes on how to look into the camera or talk to the audience or put up charts, or you
It's a great question. Do you know, when I was coming along, they really didn't have an emphasis on media presentation. That's come to the fore more and more as more and more stations have gotten into this. I mean, there's some schools, like Mississippi State is a well-known one that prepares broadcast meteorologists. And, but you can take some classes like that, but that's not really part of the meteorology curriculum. You know, you're taught more the nuts and bolts of how the atmosphere works. And then you're left kind of to get out in the field and develop a communication expertise on your own.
Did you know when you were going to college that you were going to try to be on air, or that's something that came? What point did that happen for you?
Do you know something? I've been interested in the weather my whole life, and my parents couldn't quite figure out what they'd done wrong. You know, because there's nobody in our family who has any working knowledge or works in the meteorological profession. I don't know where this came from, but it's been part of my life. I used to have paper routes, and I'd save the money and buy, you know, dream of buying weather equipment. I even wanted to buy a bedroom radar set. And I was so stupid that I thought maybe there was a fighting chance that I might be able to do that. But my parents would have preferred me to do what you're doing, or be a doctor or something like that. And they came to realize I was serious about this. And do you know something? I'm approaching 72 years old. I'll be 72 in February. And I'm more interested in the weather today than I was when I was a kid. And I didn't set off with the intention of going into media weather. I knew I wanted to go into meteorology. And the way I got into media weather was, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We moved out to New Jersey. My dad did the commute into New York every day for 13 years. And when I was in the 7th grade, my dad was transferred out to Henry Pratt Company, where that terrible shooting was. My dad was a mechanical engineer by trade, and he sold huge industrial valves to power plants and water treatment facilities. And that's what Henry Pratt Company does out here. And so we moved out to the Midwest. I used to get a map publication from Washington, D.C., from the Superintendent of Documents office, and it would arrive in New Jersey the next day. But when I got out here, it would come 4 days later. And this is before the advent of internet. When you were a young kid interested in the weather, the only way you had any weather maps or anything was what you got in the newspaper, and those generally weren't very good. So this publication was critical. And when I moved out here and realized I wasn't going to get it in time, I wrote an Aurora radio station. I was 14 years old, and I'm told I wrote an 8-page letter explaining to them with an audacity that I didn't realize I had, that I do a better job forecasting the weather for Aurora than what they were getting out of Chicago. Well, they were intrigued enough by that they thought, well, that might be interesting to put a 14-year-old on the little local radio station, and that's how my broadcast career started. And then I went up to...
So what did you do? Were you on radio in Aurora?
Well, you know what happened? The program director and I got in the car and we drove into Woodlawn Avenue on the University of Chicago campus, which is where the then Weather Bureau had their forecast office. And Chicago used to do the forecast for Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin out of that office. And sitting there at the helm at that office was a fellow by the name of Joe Folks, and we made our pitch, could we get some weather maps? And he said, well, if you'll pay for reproducing it and you'll provide self-addressed stamped envelopes, I think we can do that. And I found out later, because when we started doing the Tribune page, we brought some 40-year retired Weather Service veterans in on that project. And they said, so you're Tom Skilling. They said, we worked in the office and we would fold up these maps and put them in an envelope, and everybody said, who the heck is this Skilling guy? He said the only 2 sets of maps we sent out of that office were to Argonne National Laboratory and to Tom Skilling. So they said, so you're the one. And I said, well, you, in doing that, fostered a young career in meteorology. And
what did you do with the maps?
Well, what I did was I'd get up in the morning before I went to high school and go down to the post office and pick up, go in the back door. We had an arrangement.
Where did you go to high school?
West Aurora High School.
Okay.
Right down there off Galena Boulevard in West Aurora. And I go down and pick up the maps, and then my brother and I built a little office in the basement, and I would feed a radio show out before I went to high school every day.
And how'd that work? How did that happen?
It worked actually quite well. And I'm
did
telling
you tape record it in those years, or how'd you get a?
It was on the phone.
It was on the phone.
Yeah, yeah, we just did it on the phone, and I talked to their morning guy, and then when I come home in the afternoon, I would update it. I'd get a newspaper and look at some stuff, and I think now how ridiculous that was because I had so little data available to me, and it was kind of dated. But for a young kid to be able to actually do this. The experience I gained through doing that was awesome. We always talk about, I'm sure, Howard, you have the same thing in your firm. You bring interns in and young people who aspire to work in the legal profession. Well, we're the same in meteorology. And often when you give young people a chance to come in and actually on site see what goes on in this profession that they may one day be a part of, they learn. And they learn the jargon, they get the feel of the environment. It's invaluable, the experience.
And did your brother continue to have this passion of doing this with you, or you kind of kept going on your own?
No, I always thought, he worked, we later had a little TV station sign on there, and I wrote them and said, do you need a weather show? And they said, yes. So he helped me paint the map, and we put a plexiglass screen on it, and we did a weather show the year before I went to college up at Wisconsin. And what was great was when I went to work up there and knew I was accepted and that was where I was going to school, I went up one weekend because I wanted to work during college. And by George, I got a disc jockey shift because I'd done some I used to hang around the radio station and cut the grass and wash the windows on the weekend in addition to doing my morning weather broadcast. And my hope was by getting into radio up in Madison, I knew I was too young for them to put me on TV. But I worked for the radio station that was associated with the ABC affiliate, and the weather guy came down with spinal meningitis up there. Nobody else wanted to do the weather, so they said, kid, we haven't even done an audition tape, but you've done some weather. We're going to throw you on the air tonight, and if it works, fine. If not, your career is over, So it was, that's how that worked, and but I'm telling you, there's no better way to learn than doing it. You fall flat on your face, and if you do it in a smaller market, you can get away with that. By the time you get to Chicago, you've got to be somewhat polished and able to pull this off and not make a fool of yourself.
So were they telling you weren't allowed to go home for breaks and stuff because they needed you to do weather when you were there, or they went without weather without you?
No, it was. I don't remember, except I just remember it was wonderful. Those were wild times. It was during the Vietnam War, and there were protests all the time. They blew up the day before my classes started. They put one of these nitrogen-based fertilizer bombs, like the one that took out the Murrah Federal Building down in Oklahoma City. And they were mad about this physics building where they were doing research for the military. So some of these terrorists put a van out there and blew it up, the building. It took the whole wall of the building down, blew out every window in a mile radius. And I remember starting classes, every one of the windows in the classrooms was boarded up, and you had piles of glass in the corner where this had gone on. So it was a crazy time. And in a way, I worked all through college. I think I kept my sanity through those crazy times by going over to the weather building, and whenever there was a storm coming in, a group of grad students would gather and I would join them. And among the grad students was Louis Uccellini, who was working on his doctorate, who later became head of the National Weather Service. He just retired, and we've been friends ever since. Another fellow gathered there was head of the Storm Prediction Center now in Norman, Oklahoma, where they put out all the country tornado watches. But as a young undergrad, who was wading into this and not quite sure how to use all these maps and what they were telling me and all, it was fascinating to work with grad students who really knew what they were doing, and I learned a great deal. It was like having a college course on the side.
So what was the first job post-graduation?
Well, you know what? I worked in Madison, and I got a call from Jacksonville, Florida, the NBC affiliate. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go down there. I remember when they called me one day, I was making $40 a month because the station up there wouldn't put in the map printing machine. So I paid for that myself, and I paid for a teletype. And when it was all done, I had $40 left a month. And, it came down to I couldn't even afford my car insurance at times. It was either eat or pay your car insurance. And fortunately, the radio station news director and his wife had a farmhouse they had rented, and they had a room in the upstairs area. And he said, look, I was in a dormitory, and I joined a fraternity for a year and decided that was not right for me, because I was working all the time anyway. Yeah. And so I stayed in the room up there, and that saved money. And I got a call from Jacksonville out of the blue one day. And I remember I said to the news director who called me, he said, we saw you on a tape. We were looking at some news people, and we wondered if you would be interested in coming down and taking a weather job here. And I said, geez, first thing out of my mouth, I said, I'm not sure I could work somewhere where it doesn't snow part of the year. and the line goes dead. This guy says, my wife and I worked in Omaha and Nashville, and we swore if we never saw snow again in the rest of our lives, it would be too soon, But, and thank goodness he paused and he said, well, look, would you think about it? And could I call you back tomorrow? And I realized when I went home, I could hardly afford to clothe and feed myself, so beggars can't be choosers at that point. So I went down to Jacksonville, Florida, and the attraction there was that station. Not only was it a much larger market than Madison, but they had the Navy hurricane hunters went out of there, out of the Jacksonville Naval Air Station. And we had radar, and mini cams were coming in. I learned to work with all this technology. And we had a little Bolex 16mm camera up on the roof, and we could set it to time-lapse the big cumulonimbus Florida thunderheads developing in time-lapse and all. So it was a wonderful experience, but Jacksonville was not my cup of tea. I worked in a tropical weather regime. I never had any experience with that. The weather is entirely different. And the models that we had at that time didn't know how to handle tropical weather. I mean, they didn't handle hurricanes well or anything like that. It's a different world today. So sea breezes, which drive a lot of Florida's weather, they were beneath the scale of any of the models we worked with.
When you got this new technology and you got to that level, did you think to yourself, hey, I've been getting it wrong all these years?
Oh, you know what, I'll tell you, you have great respect for the people who came before us. You know, like all of us remember the botched 67 blizzard forecast, and we remember the April 21st Oak Lawn tornado outbreak that hit Belvedere and all. And that those meteorologists of that era, pre-satellite, pre-model, pre-Doppler radar, were able to hit as much as they did, as well as they did. You have great respect for those folks because they didn't have near the tools that we have to work with today. And so I describe my career as being like a kid in a candy store. This technology comes along, and I remember here, when my first contract was up, Milwaukee came back to me. Where I'd come down from Milwaukee, they said, we want to offer you the job back. We want you back here, and we'll let you run the whole weather department. And I said, well, will you put computer graphics in? Because I knew that was the way we were going. He said, yeah, we'll do that. So I went to my news director here, Paul Davis. I said, I know this sounds crazy going from Chicago back to Milwaukee, but they're going to put computer in for me. We put a big radar in up there. And he said to me, what makes you think we won't do that? He said, I'll tell you what, if you stay here, you and I are going to visit all the news director conferences, and we're going to talk to all the vendors of computers. The bottom line was we computerized our weather graphics here 2.5 years before the other stations did. And so it was a good move. And I used to get together with John Coleman and visit Harry Volkman, but John Coleman and I would have dinner after our respective 10 o'clock shows. And he and Pam Peniston, his artist, would come down to a little restaurant on Elm Street or out on the Kennedy, and we'd get together and we'd talk. And he would be frustrated at the lack of time he had to do the weather. And I said to him one day, as we were talking over dinner, I said, John, someday there's going to be a 24-hour cable channel and you have all the time you want. He was telling me that one of the execs at ABC had called him up when he was doing these little 2-minute cut-ins on Good Morning America. his yacht had been damaged. This exec's yacht had been damaged in a yacht club in Long Island, and he was mad at Coleman. He said, "You didn't say anything about this storm." And John looked at me, he said, "Now understand," he said, "I've got 2 minutes to do the whole country's weather, and this guy's calling me belly aching that you didn't tell him his yacht was going to be damaged." So, but he looked at me when I said, "You know, there's going to be this cable channel," and 2 weeks later he said, "You know that cable channel?" He said, "I've been working on that for 2 years." And he said, "I haven't told anybody at ABC, but Wall Street Journal Company had put up $100,000 seed money to investigate the, what a weather channel would look like, what it would take to run. And the big question was where to position it, because there were uplinks in Lake Geneva to the satellite that you'd need to communicate the signal to cable systems. And then Ted Turner had put uplinks in Georgia. And so John decided the Weather Channel would be stationed down in Georgia to take advantage of these uplinks, and he offered me a job. And I said, I went out, I saw the first demo tape done for the Weather Channel. I asked John, "Can I go with you?" He rented Merv Griffin's studio out in California. And we went out and for a whole weekend tried to produce a half-hour demo tape to show to Madison Avenue what a Weather Channel would look like. And I remember he said to me, "Who do you think we ought to get as talent on this?" And I said, "Well, I worked in Jacksonville, Florida. There's a guy who did the weather named George Winterling down there." "Oh," he said, "that's a good idea." So we brought George Winterling in out there, did the demo tape, and then later he wanted to do a follow-up demo tape to show to potential advertisers, and he asked me to do the tape. And he said, "Go to WGN and ask them if you could do it." And I did, and they said, "No, we don't want you doing that." So I said, "John, my bosses tell me no." He said, "Do it." He said, "If they fire you," he said, "I'll hire you right away at the Weather Channel." So anyway, but I didn't want to go down to Atlanta.
How many, over the years,
yeah,
how many times were you offered to be like, "Come here, we want you here," instead of WGN?
Do you know what's interesting, Howard? I remember Coleman telling me, he said, "Keep your nose clean, do your job." And he said, with all these news consulting firms, he said, if you make an impression in a market, you're going to have competitors who want to get you out of the market, so they'll get their news consultants to offer you a job in one of their other markets. So every job I've gotten has always been a job offer from somebody. I've never had to go out looking for a job. And Coleman was right on that when he said that. But I've been so happy here. I've been, my competitors look at me with knives in their eyes when we get, "How do you get all that time on the air?" And I said, "Well, they made a mistake. They let me on long enough to develop a following, and now they don't know what to do with me, so they just let me ramble on, But the time is invaluable. I'm able to do things that people with shorter allocations of time can't do. And I think it's contributed to our leadership in the weather arena. And now you've got stations doing Storm Watch 5 and First Alert this and First Alert that. They're building newscasts around weather because there is a jump you see when there's a big weather event going on, and people have their favorite stations they go to. And we've been knock on balding wood, the place that a destination place when there's breaking weather, that people come here. You know what I do? I get up, I'm in my bathrobe in my little weather den at home. I live on the north side of Chicago. I've been in that building for 45 years. I'm right on the lake, and what a place to watch Chicago's weather in the lake state and all. And I start pulling, well, let me see, Howard. I've got stuff here. This is what I pull down. I work on this all morning long. See these?
Show them over here.
Yeah. All these numbers, these are all different computer models, and they're predictions. There are 32 of them I pull down. Then I average across them, and I take this average, and I look at how they've performed in the past, what the error rate is.
And you do this every day?
Every day. And
for 45 years.
Yeah. And then we also sort through viewer pictures.
All these you do every single day?
Oh, every day, yeah. It's just do climate research. I've always thought if you can put the weather in a perspective that people can understand, like when it's hot, when you don't just say it's hot, you tell them, hey, we've only done this 3 times before in our entire weather history. that has an impact on people. They realize it puts in perspective how unusual the weather they're getting is. And I've always felt climatology and comparisons like that are relevant to people who have to live through the weather. We all do. So I've tried to do that, and part of my research every day is figuring out where we stand relative. Like the winter we had was so mild, and then we go, for 10 days into an Arctic outbreak, and it leads the news, and everybody's smacked in the face with these bitter temperatures after a warm spell. People talk about that. And they're hungry for information on how what they're living through.
Let me ask you about this dedication that you have.
Yeah.
Your first newscast is at 8 a.m. at home.
I don't really do a newscast. It's all prep work,
okay.
Howard. So
So how does it work? You get up and how long does it take you to get a model out for the day?
They're coming in all the time.
Okay.
I take runs that have been run on these models yesterday, last night, today, and then as new ones come in during the day, I add them to my list. So that, and you find when you average, this is called ensembling. And it's interesting, the whole concept developed, we had the movie on Oppenheimer recently.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer was hungry. The first mainframe computer in this country was built at Princeton University. And the two purposes to which that first computer was put was perfecting the atomic bomb, and because Oppenheimer got wind of it and he wanted to do shockwave calculations. And the guy who did it, John von Neumann, who developed the mainframe computer, was a refugee from the Nazis and the Soviets. And he always thought weather control would be the ultimate weapon. So he thought, well, look, this computer isn't going to be used at night, so Oppenheimer can run his things during the day, and I'm going to put together a numerical modeling team and see if we can model the weather. And I wonder if his thinking wasn't, if we can model the weather, then perhaps we can learn to control it. Well, it turns out it's far more complex than that. But what they found is when they modeled how the atoms split and all, no representation of a natural system is exactly perfect. So what you do is you take a group of different models that represent a system like the atmosphere, and you take the initial data and you reconfigure it a bunch of different ways. When you take a weather observation here and one here, you got to describe to the computer what's going on in between, and there are different ways to do that. So you can take a set of initial data to describe to the computer what the initial starting state of the atmosphere is. Then you run the physics equations that tell you how that's going to evolve in time. And you move the atmosphere ahead in tiny time steps, and you wind up with a weather forecast of varying length. And you do that on a supercomputer. Well, they found out when they split the atom, they needed shockwave calculations, and no one representation was perfect. So a guy by the name of Stan Ullman and his wife, a brilliant Polish mathematician who worked with the Oppenheimer group, they came up, these people drank, they drove fast cars. I mean, they were a pretty interesting group. And they also went to the casinos in Monte Carlo. And so they came up with what they called the Monte Carlo approach. This is where you take multiple forecasts and you average them together. And the studies have shown that the result of an averaged forecast is much better than the prediction from any single model. You sometimes hear us say, well, the European model says this and the American model says, that's not what we do anymore. Now what we do is we average across the European, the Australian, the Korean, the German, all kinds of US models that we run. And we come up with a consensus forecast, and you see right away which components of this forecast are going off the rails, and you throw them out, and you have a greater confidence that the storm you're predicting coming in is going to work that way. You see it in hurricane forecasts where they show those spaghetti plots of where the storm's going to move. Those are all different computer models with slightly different initialization schemes and physics. And if you run all of them and you find when you average across them, you come up with a consensus forecast, then you have a higher level of confidence in that prediction than you would off the one or two models we used to in the old days work with.
When you would go out at 10 o'clock at night, when your night newscast was over and you'd be with some of the weathermen from some of the other stations, did you talk weather about like how you were modeling and kind of get a consensus among yourself what you were going to talk up to the Chicago viewers, or you just talked about other things and everybody did their own weather themselves?
It's a great question because I think people think we commiserate. I don't have time. I don't know. I don't have time to watch what they're doing, and I'm surprised when they have time to watch what I'm doing. I'm so busy doing what I'm doing, and you read, you get a second opinion from your National Weather Service colleagues who will write synopses of what their thinking is and coming up with the forecast they come with, and we all look at the same model data, so we're all looking at the same raw data. So there isn't much discussion among us, and in a way that's kind of good because I get nervous when I start seeing other forecasts. Somebody call up and say, "Oh, Channel 5 says there's going to be 20 inches of snow," and I think, God, am I missing something? First of all, you shouldn't be predicting 20 inches of snow because it's happened only 3 times in the entire weather history of Chicago. So if you ever see a guy put a 20-inch thing on the internet or anything like that, he should never do that. And people are doing that in this social media environment. It's a misuse of the data, and it shows a lack of understanding of what the shortcomings of modeling are. But second,
let me ask you this. Do you think your success with your viewership was more on getting the modeling right and telling people this is what the weather, or do you think your success is more like people just like my personality and they liked how I talked to them? Which one do you think was?
Oh, it's the latter.
Oh, really?
It's the latter. Yeah. I can do all this work and all, and to not, if I'm not putting it across. No, they look at me and they think he's crazy. I mean, this guy's a weather nerd, and he's getting a kick out of this, and I'm going to go to the party and see what's entertaining him. He seems to find this kind of interesting. I remember when I would talk with John Coleman, who always, had incredible, he had an incredible shtick, as he would say.
Yeah.
He says, you got to have a shtick. And I remember when he said that to me as a young forecaster visiting him in high school and college, I thought, God, that's a problem for me because I don't have a shtick. Well, my shtick turned out being that I'm a weather crazy and a weather nerd, and it's amazing the number of people have said to me, I'm not sure I understand everything you say, but you seem to be getting a kick out of it, and so I decide I'm going to check into it and see what in the world you're doing. And what they find out is, I used to scare the news consultants to death. They said, nobody understands what. I said, well, how are they going to understand it if you don't talk about it? I said, this is not brain surgery. You show them a jet stream, it shows where the weather is coming from. There's nothing complicated about that. It turns out the jet stream tells us a lot of other stuff too. But so I think that's if I've succeeded, and I'm almost 72, and they haven't fired me, so I presume presume this worked out all right, And we, looking back on it, because I always thought I was going to get fired, but but looking back on it, I think, isn't it something? I've got to 72 years old, and I made it through this dog-eat-dog business of ours, And I think what it is people think, well, he seems to be interested in this and having fun, and let's go along for the ride and see where it winds up. And over time, they've come to realize that, well, that's kind of interesting, figuring out not only what it's going to do tomorrow, but where it's coming from and why he thinks it's going to do that,
Did you start at the beginning having more like a 2-minute segment, and then it developed over time?
Oh, my God. I'll tell you, the producers hated me because I'd run overtime, and we had many discussions, just like we do now. They want to leave the show with an inch of snow in January, and I say, why are we doing that? This is Chicago. It's January. It gets cold, and it snows in January. And this is not a big storm we've got. The people will drive tomorrow, and they want to know what it's going to do. So I lose those battles all the time with my producers. But people are very media savvy these days. They presume that we do stuff only for ratings and all the rest. And that's not why I'm doing it. I look ahead to a storm potential because I find it interesting and I flag it, and I want to, alert people to the fact, hey, if you got some travel plans or something that's weather sensitive, here's a period to keep your eye on. We don't know all the details yet, but something's going to happen. We're good enough anymore that we can see that almost a week ahead of time, and even more on occasion. So. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what we do, and that's why it's fun to talk. And
what I'm fascinated by is, you have a very strong reputation in weather, and people follow you. I'm just fascinated by the fact that you were able to make it 45 years at one station without being pulled into like a national weather station or cable or like one of the other competing stations in the market? What kept you grounded?
Well, I don't think they were hungry for me, because I think they thought, boy, if we bring him in, we got to give him a 5 or 6 minute weather segment, and we don't want to do that. So I've had some general managers tell me, we looked at you and we saw some research on you, but they didn't want to spend that kind of time on the weather. We do in this station. You know, we have the luxury of an hour newscast. We can do things that other stations can't. They've got network programming in front of them and back of them that they've got to hit, and they have a half an hour window to do everything. We've had an hour. Now we have an hour and a half. So I'll tell you, that's one of the beauties of working at WGN. We've had time to do that. That's why I've got to believe a Phil Donahue came to fame here, and Bozo and all. There's a freedom here at WGN that doesn't exist in every other station. Our managers are here making decisions. It's not coming in from New York or some distant location where they really don't totally understand the fine points of the market and all. And WGN isn't like that. We are Chicago's very own. This isn't just a slogan. We were the Cubs station, the Bulls station, the White Sox station, you name it. We were associated with the Chicago Tribune, a journalistic institution of huge proportions, and so people have come to trust us, and that gives us a unique ability to connect with the audience, I think.
It's very interesting that you say that the powers that be here built the station around the talent that they had, and they let them be who they are. Yeah, that's really great.
It really is. And thank you. As an advertiser, you make this possible. Howard, and I look at your involvement in the community. I mean, you're the same way. This is very unique. You go above and beyond the call of duty, and everything you do. You work with our teacher recognition program. You sponsor our weather program. It's something. I think Chicagoans gravitate toward organizations like that.
I'm just sitting here listening to you, by the way, and you explain my life to me listening to you, because when you're passionate about life,
absolutely,
you're just passionate about it, and you do things, and the world kind of works around you because you're passionate about your life.
That's why I wanted to meet you. Yeah. I watch you, and this comes across, and people at a very human level.
I really appreciate it coming from you, by the way, Tom.
No, it really is true.
Thank you very much.
I'm not feeding you a line. I've often thought, here's a guy who clearly likes what he's doing, loves what he's doing, loves the community in which he's doing it. And there's something to be said for that, and I think people gravitate toward that, and they want to know what makes us tick. I'm not sure we understand it all the time, but I think our intentions are good, and so it's interesting. You ask interesting questions.
I am just so fascinated by the work that you do. There's computers and models, but you still do this by hand.
I know, isn't that something?
Like how you used to do it probably 40 years ago. You're still doing it that way.
Well, it's evolved. I didn't have this wealth of information. The internet came along. I mean, they were running these models for years, but we only got a fraction, just the tip of the iceberg of data. Now with the internet, they feed all this stuff out to you. I subscribe to 4 different databases, and they've taken the output from the Weather Service, and credit our National Weather Service. People say the government, they don't do things right. Nonsense. This National Weather Service is a gem in our country. The research they've funded over the years, the operational meteorological work they do, it's stunning. The taxpayer is doing, really receiving a quality product from the Weather Service. And we're now, thanks to increased communication speed, accessing data from these model fields that we only could dream of looking at years ago.
I'm fascinated by this. Because we're here, it's late at night. How you get up in the morning, you put this together. What time do you get here and start doing? Start telling people about the weather. And how late do you go? Is this like a 12 or 14-hour day for you?
Oh, it is. Yeah, I don't think I've ever worked an 8-hour day. Look, I have wonderful people who work with me too. You met Bill Snyder. We had 4 Weather Service retirees with 40 years experience who worked with us on the Tribune page when we did that. And by the way, the reason we stopped, media companies tend to want their proprietary products on their own platforms, because we're advertiser driven, and therefore if you put them on your own platform, you can market it that way. And WGN paid for the production of the Chicago Tribune weather page for years. So we decided it was time to move to our own platform. And I loved working with the Tribune people. But I get in here about 4:30. It's mayhem. I come through traffic and all, and I fed all this stuff out to Bill, and we've got a graphics package that we worked with for months. So Bill can help plug in some of the stuff, and I come in and help him when I get in here too, and it's crazy. But you're constantly updating. You know, before we get on tonight, we'll look at the whole new model run suite and see what we tweak our forecast if we have to. So
let me ask you, when you're talking about technology,
yes,
and they talk about like AI,
yeah,
where do you think things are going with AI and
great
weather?
question. Great question, because there have been some articles recently. Somebody wrote me on social media and said, boy, you're getting out of here just in time because AI is ready to take your job. Nonsense. You know, first of all, a lot of what we're hearing about these AI-driven programs, we've not seen the products in the operational field to evaluate them ourselves. And the people that have a vested economic stake in selling these products are the ones verifying them and telling us how valuable they are. I called Louis Uccellini, my friend, a month ago, and I said, Louis, has anybody reporting on all this AI development in weather forecasting called you, the former head of the Weather Service, who a big part of your job was working on improving models and working with your modeling people? I mean, we have multi-million-dollar supercomputers that are involved, and the implication seems to be in some of these AI stories that all this is for naught, that they're going to do on a laptop computer what we can. And to that I say BS. It isn't going to work that way. But I think AI will become a component of the whole thing. The thing is, they better tell us more about what they're doing with it. And they've not come clean with what they're doing, and I think they're overselling it. And I'll tell you another thing, as a profession that watched computerization come in, when I was going to school, I think there was the feeling in some in our profession that we're going to be computerized out of existence. Nonsense. In fact, I found that when you put the computer improved products out there, the human comes in and takes it yet another step. We're always able to improve on this stuff. So the human can't be, you know, I suppose if you get a cutthroat business that wants to just look at the bottom line only and is not worried about accuracy and all, they could put something in. I mean, a lot of these apps that you get on your phone with weather forecasts, these iconic, this stuff is raw computer stuff. It's terrible, a lot of it. It's inaccurate. They show one little icon for the whole day when the day may be split between heavy snow in the morning and sun in the afternoon. And it's not telling you any of the details that you need if you're trying to plan around the weather. So I think we're entering an interesting phase, and I don't think it's at all clear that AI is going to take all of our jobs. I mean, I think so you probably hear the same thing in the legal profession. You know,
it's all everybody talks about is AI and how it's going to change the world.
Howard, you're safe. I'm telling you something. I think we're going to find out. And if our experience in meteorology, when all this computer stuff came in, is any guide, we're going to find it makes our lives more interesting, enables us to do more things better, and this is not going to threaten all the jobs that they claim it is. It might take the mundane jobs, and we've got to worry about that because we've got to have jobs for people to do. But I think we're going to find it's a net plus, and that we're going to find the humans are still involved in the process and improving it, because we've found that in meteorology.
Yeah. Let me ask you, and if I'm asking a trade secret or something, then don't respond.
Not at all.
Who's going to be the next Tom Skilling? Like, let me ask, like, who's coming in after
Oh,
you? Are you helping? Are you helping to choose? Or they don't know what they're doing yet?
I don't know what, I'm not involved in that, and I never have been.
Yeah.
And that's probably just as well. I remember John Coleman years ago when he said, people come to me for jobs, and he said, if I was recommended to my boss as somebody, that probably would be a net negative for the person, you know. So, but I'm not involved in that. Look, There are fantastic, bright young people coming along, and I don't know who it will be, but there will be others who do a phenomenal job and capture the attention and interest of our viewers. And believe me, if there's a company and a station that's going to find the right person to do that, it's this one. And it may be a little different for people to begin with because the style will be a little different, but there are a lot of bright people in our profession. There really are, and our profession it's onward and upward. There are neat things going on.
You know, you got boxes of like fan letters and stuff there. What do you do? Do you have time for that with everything else that you're doing?
You know what? By the time you answer what comes in on social media, you know, one of the great failures is people write me hard copy letter. I can't get to all of them. I don't have a staff to help me out with this. People will ask for signed pictures and weather maps and stuff like that, and I try and send them out as I can. But there are going to be a lot of people I simply can't get to to answer, and I'm a lot of what I do during the day is answer questions and go through mail and correspondence I get by way of social media. Say what you will about social media, it has a lot of problems. But when we get a severe weather situation, often the first thing that we in my line of work get, the news we get on how badly a storm has affected an area comes in by way of social media, be it photos, reports, stuff like that. So it's become an incredible tool for us. And but I'm telling you, Howard, you've identified a place where I will, to my dying day, lament the fact I didn't do a better job to keep up with it because it just, the volume of it is beyond what I can handle.
Yes, you want to make sure that you're always, you know, returning people's calls and being there for people.
Yeah.
But by the time you got to do your J job and then you want to be there for everybody, there's only 24 hours in the day.
That's it.
It's very difficult.
I'm sure you face the same thing. Anybody in any line of work, and it's so. There's so many ways and communication channels by which people can reach out to all of us that it becomes impossible to cater to the questions from everybody, and you kick yourself for not being able to do it.
So I'm sure this is not going to be the last, you know, stop on the train ride.
No.
What do you think you're going to do now? What's the next step?
Well, you know, I've got all kinds of ideas, and it's funny. I kind of feel, I don't know. I'm going in, this is uncharted territory. And for a long time, before I made the decision, it scared me. And it still does. Because I've worked since I was a teenager, and I've had a regular paycheck coming in, and I knew what I was going to do every day, and there are great variables. But I'll tell you a couple of things I'm looking at. I'd love to start speaking on climate. I've done that for years with our congressional reps and all. I think that would be interesting. I'm going to sit down with our station here. I'd love to be involved in projects here at WGN. There are stories I'd love to do that I'm not able to do doing a nightly weather show. And we did a series on climate change, which I just love doing, and there was so much more we could have done on that subject. So projects like that, covering stories and all. You know, an interesting story, Louis Uccellini was at NASA when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up before he went to the Weather Service. And he was telling me about that day. An ashen-faced NASA employee, he was out at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, Greenbelt, Maryland. And he said, somebody came in and said, my God, the space shuttle's just blown up. And they all went running down to a conference room there at NASA Goddard. And he said, I looked at that cloud. He said, my God, they launched them into a wind shear. And, you know, there was all this concern about icicles and O-rings burning out and all. And Louis, we did a retirement piece with him. He came in here and we drove up to Madison together and talked the whole way. And I'd ask him, I said, would you drive with me up there to the place where you got your doctorate? And we both met each other and all. He said, yeah. So turns out we lived in the same dormitory up there. But he was telling me about, he said they launched a weather balloon afterwards to, he and another group of colleagues had been modeling upper winds. And he said, we ran a model, and there was indeed wind shear on the model, but they wanted to get confirmation. And after these space launches, they launched balloons an hour prior to the launch and an hour afterwards, knowing that if there are any problems, they're going to want to know what happened. And so he said, I couldn't, they launched a balloon an hour after this thing and nobody would give me the data. And his boss there said, you should look into this and make no judgment calls. Don't say it shouldn't have happened or anything. Just tell them what you find. And they did confirm. He said 2 years later, he was sitting at his desk at Goddard and an email comes in with the entire balloon sounding, which confirmed what their models had said, that in fact there had been a wind shear. And by some calculations, had they flown a jet aircraft through the 44,000 foot level, I believe it was, there would have been damage to the aircraft because of the turbulence and all that was going on. So here you've got a spacecraft going up with O-rings that we know almost had burned through in so many launches ahead of time. Could this have been another stick that broke the camel's back? I'd love to do a story on that. Louis said, I'll work with you on that. He said, we're not pointing fingers. We were trying to understand what happened there, what went wrong. And believe me, I'm sure there's been a lot of investigation of that already. But I think it would be interesting to investigate a story like that.
Can you, when you are like out on a regular day, it's a weekend or something like that, do you need all the modeling to understand what's going to be happening with the weather? Or is there something about just being out and you're like, yeah, I can tell it's going to rain in 2 hours, or like the weather's going to change? Like, do you have that ability to do that?
Oh, yeah, but you know what's amazing is you do, but I find when I look at satellite imagery, I see things that I never would have suspected are going on just from visual examination of the sky. It was funny. I remember there was a meteorology text, forecast text, and they said, nothing you can see looking out the window will impact the forecast in the time frame you're looking ahead to forecast for. In other words, we don't always get signals the day before that something's going to happen the next day. Weather systems don't work like that. But we now see over the horizon with satellite imagery, and it's just amazing what we're able to see these days. I mean, think about it. 70% of the planet was ocean and poorly observed. In order for a model to predict an Arctic outbreak in Chicago, we've got to know what's going on over all the oceans, because a buckle in the jet stream off Japan or off Europe will immediately affect the jet stream around the rest of the planet. It's all interconnected. And so in order to forecast Chicago's weather, we've got to know what's going on halfway across the planet. And that's why an El Nino that occurs thousands of miles away out in the equatorial Pacific screws up our winter. Why the Arctic outbreak we had last week was the result of a dome of warm air that developed over Greenland. It forced the Arctic air that had been happy to sit up in Canada to come crashing down on us by buckling the jet stream and all. So when you see something like a warm dome developing over Greenland, you say, aha, cold wave. We alerted our viewers to it a week ahead of time. So we got a Greenland block developing. We're probably going to have the coldest air of the winter. And after a warm winter, that gets some attention, and it should.
Do you think we'll be able to affect the weather in the future? Like, will we be able to fly a plane like over like a warm weather front or something that will affect the weather later?
The problem is, if you start, first of all, the only way you're going to affect the weather is by changing heat distribution. You got to find an energy source that can produce the kind of heat on a scale that you're going to produce it. Then you got to know where to add that heat. And then you've got to realize that if you add the heat and you get the effect in a place where you're living that you want, you're going to create effects in the atmosphere upstream and downstream that may flood other areas and create problems. So the idea that humans are going to come in and start controlling the weather isn't going to happen. It's far too complex. We may work around the edges, like they can cloud seed a certain kind of cloud that's ready to precipitate anyway. But if you got a drought going, you can't go up and seed the atmosphere and get it to rain. You got to have a cloud that's about ready to rain anyway, and then you might kick it over to rain production. And a lot of people don't realize that. People will say during a drought, why don't you just go out and seed the clouds? Or hurricanes. If you put an oil slick out ahead of a hurricane and cut down on the latent heat release from the ocean, you could dampen the intensity of the hurricane. But what would you do to the ecosystem you're spreading oil all over to do? And do you have enough oil to spread over a wide enough area to get the effect you want? It's a very complex proposition. And ski resorts seed clouds in Colorado and all, and they have to do environmental impact studies. And they may coax some additional snow out of a cloud band, but there's no guarantee of that, and there's even a bit of controversy over how well that really works. Years ago they were seeding hurricanes, thinking they could diminish the intensity, and they're not sure that the intensity fluctuations that they saw wouldn't have happened anyway. Nobody could prove it. We don't understand the physics of a hurricane well enough, although we're getting better and better at it.
So that people can hear it out of the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
When they say global warming is a hoax,
no.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, we've known that global warming was going to happen since before the Civil War. I mean, there were scientists before Abraham Lincoln came into office and we started fighting who said, we're going to warm up. The Industrial Revolution had started in 1750, and they realized when you release a heat-absorbing and re-radiating gas like carbon dioxide and also methane and all the other pollutants, that ultimately, over time, you're going to build this up, and we know that's happening. We've got more carbon dioxide in the air now than has been in the atmosphere in any time in the last 4 million years. Humans have walked this planet only 300,000 years, and civilization, as we know it, has only been around 6 million years, 6,000 years on a 4.5 billion year old planet. Everybody goes back to Ice Age. I've had people write and say, what happened? Did dinosaurs start flatulating? Is that why, the release of methane warmed it? Ice ages were the product of 20,000 year variations in the shape of our orbit around the sun. They're called Milankovitch cycles. And the fact the planet wobbles on its axis, this changes how hemispheres are pointed at the sunlight and the amount of sunlight we're getting. So that and asteroid strikes formed the big ice ages. What's happening now is entirely different. It's all chemically driven. We're changing the composition of the atmosphere, and we're putting gases in that change the retention of heat in the atmosphere. When you start fiddling with the heat balance of the atmosphere, you change the wind patterns, the jet streams that guide our storms. And the insidious thing about climate change, and the reason people feel so self-assured about saying, oh, climate change, it's a hoax, is because they don't see it out their window every day. That's not the way climate change happens. Climate change is a gradual thing spread over decades, and it affects some areas more than others, and it tends to occur in extreme weather events. And that's what we're seeing increasing. Faster developing hurricanes, heat waves that are getting hotter where they occur, rain patterns that are hurricanes are slowing down and getting wetter. This is what climate change is doing, and it will affect some areas more than others. But, the whole expansion of human civilization has occurred in a relatively stable period in the Earth's climate. If we start interfering with that, and we seem to be starting to do that, then we're going to get more extreme events. We're going to produce heat waves that people literally can't survive anymore. And that's starting to happen. And you look at history on this planet, this notion that climate change hasn't affected anything is nonsense. There are all kinds of examples. I talk about the Dust Bowl. I mean, all these people migrated to the Plain States and thought they're going to farm out there, and then the climate changed, and we had a Dust Bowl. People died out there. They lost everything they owned. That was a climate change. Sea levels are rising. We're going to lose the Florida Keys. It's just going to happen. And the question is, how fast will it happen, and can we slow it down? And as a young forecaster, I used to think, you're going to have to prove this to me. And, well, it's been proved. I see now the logic in what's going on and why the Arctic is warming at 3 and 4 times the speed of other areas. Climate change is happening 10 times faster than it has ever occurred in the whole existence of humankind. And we have never had the kind of population on the planet we do now. So these changes will start impacting more people more directly. And it's time that we clean up our act. And no means of producing energy is totally clean. I mean, people criticize electric cars because they use batteries that use rare earth materials. There's no perfect solution. But think about the evolution of energy in this country. We went from burning wood to burning coal to oil to gas, and now we have solar involved in it. Every one of them has taken us a step cleaner. And this country is, you know, we've dropped CO2 emissions, and we're going to drop it more as more cars are electric and stuff like that. So there are good things going on. There are a lot of smart people working on cleaner forms of energy, and there are jobs to be had with that, and it's very exciting.
Let me ask you an important question.
Yeah.
If somebody came to you and said they need a lawyer, what would you tell them?
I would tell them you, my friend. I'll tell you something. You know what I like? I think I can talk to you, and I've sensed that just in your commercials and all. And I think when you talk to an attorney, and we all need attorneys, you want somebody you can talk with, who seems like a real human being and that you can be frank with and talk with. And Howard, you strike me that way. So I'll tell you something. I honestly, I'm not giving you a line there either. That's all right. It's so good. This has been such fun. I hope this has been all right. I've been rambling here, but
no ramble. This has been great.
It's great. I've had a lot of fun, and how nice of you to come over here on our schedule and do this. I know how busy your days are. Thank you.